All right, we're back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests get to share their successes and setbacks that they've experienced across their journey, with a specific emphasis on how they've overcome specific obstacles that otherwise could have ended their journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Bolton. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate you having me.
Well, it was a pleasure getting to know you offline. Now we get to take it to online version where we always like to just dive right into things, get to know you a little bit, and have the audience get to know how you became a leader in the accessibility space.
Yeah, that's great. So it's interesting. So I'm in my mid 40s. And so I'm of that generation where computers were always a part of what I was doing, right? They were in every classroom I was in as a kid, always had a computer at home. And so interacting with computers and being part of that digital space is just part of my life, right? And it has always been. And through that process, I've always kind of had this natural tendency to help and teach, right? Helping the person next to me in class figure out how to use the software program, or helping, my mom or some other family member figure out how to navigate a new device or whatever that might be. And over time in my career, and I don't think we've had a chance to talk about this, Brian, but I've done a number of different things. I was a band instrument repair technician for a while. And for a while, I was an aerial photographer managing multi-million-dollar camera systems in planes, in flight. And the through thread for me in all those things is this innate passion and desire to know how things work. And then when they're not working, figure out why and how to make it better and how to fix it, right? And so my accessibility journey really started, I guess, probably about 15 years ago or so. My math on years is always a little fuzzy, but when I started working for an e-commerce company and was doing web quality assurance in e-commerce. Over time, that grew into the space I'm in now. I work for Carnegie, a higher education marketing and enrollment agency. And what I do for them is primarily a quality assurance for marketing websites built in content management systems. And a big focus of the work I do is the accessibility piece. And so, at the end of the day, for me, it's all about how do we get the other human beings on the end of things that we're building to be able to have a good experience and complete the tasks that they're trying to complete.
I love it. I know you were kind of smirking when you're like, I have a tendency to want to help people. You helped your parents and whatnot. I mean, so many folks that join me on Beyond Barriers start with the introduction about accessibility becoming a very important part of their career, mostly from their personal life of things that drove that passion. And so I couldn't help but call out when you're like smirking, because it's like that's most of the folks that I talk to. I guess somewhat of the head scratcher for me is how do we flip that conversation so that it's not just folks that have that innate curiosity and desire to help. I mean, I think that's in the human DNA to want to do good, but how do we flip that script? But I think we'll unpack that maybe as part of what you've uncovered scaling some of the strategies. Tell me a little bit about your career, offline work to a little bit of online with camera to then e-com and now on the commerce side of higher ed. What are some of the fundamentals that have stuck with you or that helped you build to get to where you are in the QA space and being able to deliver accessible products?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things for me, and one of the things that I'm constantly reminding myself of, is how do I push this thing beyond the expected, right? So if we're building a feature panel for a website and I'm testing that, how do I push that with content in a way that's going to expose potential real world flaws, both from just physically breaking the user interface to the accessibility side of that, of course, and making sure that, the keyboard navigation is in place and that the ARIA labels make sense so that screen readers are reading the right things. And so for me, it's always that pushing of the boundary, right? okay, well, we've always done it this way, but can we make it better? Is this iteration better than the one we did yesterday? And so that's a big piece of what I do. A friend of mine, Jim, kind of taught me that early on in my QA career about like, don't just test expected input, because in the real world, that's not what happens, right? Somebody's going to enter an invalid email. Somebody's going to make a heading on a web page way longer than it maybe should be, but it's going to be there anyway. And so that's a big part of like kind of my, I don't know, internal ethos is like push this thing in both directions, right? Like too much information, not enough information, and kind of everything in between has been one of the bigger things that's carried through a lot of those different iterations of my career.
Interesting. Do you find yourself trying to share these, I was going to say best practices first, but really what I mean is your excitement and your energy, right? Like we're a few minutes into the conversation, you get me jazzed up, and so it's like, as a leader, how do you instill that in the team that you're supporting, the product that you're building, the impact that it has on the customer?
Yeah, for sure. So I love like coaching people. Like it excites me. And so I'm lucky to have a very receptive team that I work with at Carnegie. I'm kind of one of two kind of main accessibility subject matter experts on our team. The other, Elena, her background is in like design and user experience from that perspective. And so the two of us work really good as a pair with kind of my more technical approach and skill set and her design skill set. And the two of us are always kind of partnering together to let's thread this accessibility work from day one through each project that we're doing, and not just, okay, we're getting ready to launch a new website for this client. Oh, I guess we better make sure it's accessible, right? That's definitely
The afterthought.
not my approach, right? Like I think that is ultimately just set you up for failure, right? And so I'm lucky to, like our front end devs are, I'm always afraid that people like get irritated when they see me message them on Slack because like, oh, he's going to tell me something's broken again. But actually, that's really not the case. Like I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of developers, and everybody kind of seems hungry to learn more, do better, and oh gosh, I didn't know that thing. Thank you for sharing it with me. And so that makes it nice. I think sometimes we can struggle with clients who don't know or understand, have the depth of understanding of why accessibility is important, and that it's not just a flip of a switch, right? There's some work and iteration involved to do the right thing and make it the right way. And so that tends to be a little bit more of a struggle, I think, as far as, educating clients and getting clients on board for the importance of that piece of the work.
Mm. So shifting topics a little bit, you've seen obviously years of real life implementation and trying to scale and manage these strategies. Talk to me a little bit about what that strategy looks like. I mean, I think you started to get into it because you have a yin and the yang from a counterpart and a receptive team, but where are some of the issues that you run into when you're trying to drive scale, and maybe because it's the business is growing, the business is shifting with product focus? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, one of the things that is kind of unique about the work that we do in the web division at Carnegie, working with, for the most part, large, complex institutions, like, I mean, there are some smaller schools that are a little more simplified and streamlined, but most schools are pretty large. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of voices in the room. And so finding ways to get buy-in and finding ways to like expose historical weaknesses in their systems to get everybody on the same place and all pushing and rowing in the same direction is a huge part of that equation. And we really start that like from day one when we're doing like discovery with clients and figuring out what they have, what's working well, what are your pain points, what are your goals for a brand new website, right? Like that's like the bread and butter project for us is designing and implementing a whole brand new marketing prospective student website. And so a big piece of that is, where are you now and like, where do you want to be? And then we're threading through the whole thing is how do we make this a better user experience and a more accessible experience for everybody that's coming to your site.
Are you saying that's a part of your culture and DNA of what you guys deliver as a product?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been so successful, and and the websites that we build tend to win awards and do well and generate you know more prospective student inquiries and all those good things that schools are looking for, is because like that's the focus, right? It is you're obviously most schools, not every school, but most schools are looking to grow, right? And so how do we do that? How do we give the human beings on the other side of your website a better user experience, a better picture of who you are as an institution, so that you can then attract them as a new student, right? And a big piece of that is that user experience and the accessibility piece of that, right? And so every human being that comes to that website, whether they're on an iPhone or they're on a laptop or whatever it is, needs to be able to access all that information so that they know whether or not they want to come to your school, right? And so like if they're using a screen reader, that has to work well. If they're using keyboard only to navigate, that has to make sense so that they can access the information they need. And so providing that like outstanding user experience, which I think accessibility is, to me, like those two are the same, right?
Right.
And inseparable, right? Like you can't have a good user experience if it's not accessible, because you're leaving users out. And so yeah, we do our best to bake it in through the whole process. And I mean, we're human beings too, right? So we're not perfect. And each time we go through the process, we learn something new, and we fold that into the next thing that we're doing, and we continue to get better, right?
So the buy-in and the feedback that you get from your clients, is it generally like, thank goodness you're here, this is something we're a little bit outgunned on ourselves?
Yeah, we do tend to see a lot of that. I think the pain points that we occasionally come across. So oftentimes we're working with folks like in the like marketing communications department at a particular higher ed, school. The pain points tend to come in and they kind of get it, right? For the most part, I think. But a lot of bureaucracy at most higher education institutions. And
Yeah.
so when there are other people who are, again, less familiar with the kind of the what's and whys of the digital world, it can be a little harder, and trying to explain to a board of regents or a president or whoever it might be that a new website takes more than a month. A new large complex
Yeah, large
website
scale.
takes
Right.
more than right. Like most of these websites have thousands of pages, multiple different types of content, from faculty profiles to program pages to like there's a lot going on and a lot of I wouldn't say problems to be, yeah, problems to be solved, right?
Yeah.
And so that kind of bureaucracy layer, it tends to be where we can occasionally get some rub, right? And
How do you overcome?
yeah, usually people who are a lot smarter and charming than me, are our account managers and those kinds of people are the ones who are typically dealing with those relationships and
Yep.
smoothing those paths, right? And getting folks, and we do our best to have aggressive timelines, right? Like, I mean, I think everybody, myself included, I want the thing and I want it now, right? But we try to play that balance of let's do it with some speed, but let's make sure it's done with excellence, right? And so that striking that balance with folks is key, and so we've started in a few cases providing some like accessibility training to larger teams at some of these higher education institutions,
Mm-hmm.
where we've done like some workshops about like, this is what digital accessibility is. This is what it means. Here are some of the, broad terms and concepts, and just educating folks on the barriers that some people face when interfacing with digital technology, and how there are methods in place to make it so that they can still interact in a way that gets them to where they want to be, right? And so I think for the clients who we have done that with, they've seen a very greatly increased like interest in that topic, and a new passion from people about, yes, this is important. We should make sure we're doing this. And so I'm excited about those opportunities to be able to do that kind of thing. I'm actually speaking at a conference in January to a room full, hopefully, of kind of upper level leaders in that higher education space.
Yeah.
And that kind of talk too, about getting people to understand how important it is.
And I would imagine it's sometimes almost tough for you, or it's like kind of a head scratcher, because I think I heard you had said it's kind of in the Carnegie DNA, right? So was it just something that leadership mandated? How did that balance come into the, because it's like even when you mandate something, it doesn't ultimately become culture, right? It doesn't become part of the oil that runs the engines.
Yeah.
Have you been able to, I guess I'm curious what that was like to get it as such an intrinsic part of the DNA, because it sounds like, I don't know, so many people that I talk to, it's like, yeah, leadership doesn't want to buy into it, or we're really just focused on a couple of the pieces of the compliance so we don't get sued. It's like, that's, I don't know. To me, that's such
Right.
a wrong. I don't know. Pay the $70,000 fine and get sued, because it's probably cheaper than doing these. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And that is such an interesting piece of the equation. And so, like, one of the pillars at Carnegie is human connection, right? Like it's like a foundational, and has been since well before I was part of the company, and before the web division as it exists now came on board a few years ago. And so being interested in human connection and like being people first in general as part of the culture obviously makes that conversation much easier, right? And there's a lot of open door, easy communication as well. And so when myself and Elena and some of these other folks that I've mentioned have had ideas about, hey, we could do this thing and make it better, those conversations have generally, fallen on interested ears, even if they didn't know that it was an issue before it was raised. They were like, that is important. I appreciate you explaining that to me. So now that we can go address that, right? And I think, so that's been a nice thing in the Carnegie culture, right? Like it's really has been baked in for a very, very long time. Like I said, I didn't even get to see that in its infancy, right?
Yeah.
And so trying to foster that same kind of buy-in and enthusiasm with our clients on the projects that we work on is the hard part. And like I said, I think when we're given the opportunity to educate people about how important it is, beyond a compliance perspective, right? Because I think a lot of schools are, in that same kind of boat of like, well, we'll worry about it if we get sued, right? Because budgets are tight, right? I mean, higher education, it's an unstable place right now. Schools are closing, budgets are shrinking. Various state and federal programs are in flux, and so schools have a lot to think about, right? Like,
Yeah. It's
and somebody coming to them in the midst of an expensive project and saying, hey, we need to pay extra care for this thing without some education is hard, right? And so I think educating people about, they're at the end of the day, there is a human being at the end of your digital communication, and that human being deserves to be able to consume that information, right, regardless of their ability or disability, right? And so, and I think once people have someone stop and sit down and explain those kinds of things to them, the
We
vast
can
majority
use
of
this podcast because it's an amazingly compelling conversation about why to do it, and this simplicity. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's like, you know, I don't know.
yeah,
I
most
imagine,
people jump on board, right? Like
yeah,
they're like, oh gosh, that is important. I had never really stopped to think about the deaf prospective student or that blind prospective student and how they may or may not be able to sign up for a scholarship or whatever that action they're trying to take on your website is. Um, so that's the stuff that I get really excited about. Like, I mean, and I get really excited about the technical end of things too when I'm working through a problem with my devs. But, kind of the advocacy piece of all this is such a huge part of like
What's
what I
the
want to be doing.
biggest? Sorry, I didn't mean to switch directions, but I'm curious to know. You had said the passion of working with your devs, right? What's the biggest win that you've had with the developers? Period.
Yeah. Gosh, like I said, we're in this kind of very purposeful mode of like continuous improvement is one of our big things in the last couple of years. I would say a couple of the more interesting things that we've done is really stopping to take a look at tables, and how those transform between a desktop view and a mobile view, and making sure that screen readers can access those things. Like, it's such an interesting, very small problem, right? But again, for the clients we're working with, tables tend to get used pretty frequently. And so if they're not up to par, cumulatively, that causes a big problem, right? And so a lot of times it's things like a table with tuition information or fee information or
The
that kind
super
of stuff.
important fine print stuff.
Right. And at some point, student A needs to know that information, right? Like, how much is, the fee for my science class, And so our general approach now has been to, in mobile, move to a stacked view of tables, because trying to scroll on a mobile device side to side and up and down in a table, like multi-scroll direction, not good user experience, not accessible, right? And so like that, I was really proud of like working through that with our folks. And again, and a piece of that was also, again, like selling that concept to clients. Like, yeah, a stacked mobile table, when you first look at it as a sighted, person, is a little like, wait, like what's going on here? Because that's not how tables have traditionally in the last 20 years of the web been presented. But when we explain the whys, they're like, oh, okay, like, that's great. So that's been a big one. We've also put a bunch of effort into carousels or sliders and making sure that the way those are built out, again, is functioning and working well. And so again, working through those various pieces, like, well, what should the ARIA label for these previous and next carousel controls be saying? And is next and previous enough, or do we need more context for what this slider is? So those are a couple of the things that we've been like refining and fine tuning and have been,
Mm.
like I said, kind of like, again, like small challenges, but like in the long run, because of how often they get used, to make a big difference to somebody's experience on the website.
There's something I want to come back to, but I'm just curious. You had said continuous improvement. Can you measure this type of continuous improvement that you have gone through, or what? How do you validate the
Yeah, it's interesting. So
commercial juice?
some of our clients, will kind of sign on for like long-term support.
Yep.
And it's a little easier with those folks to kind of have some metrics in place that we can track and have access to, whether that's through, like heat mapping results or user testing, even just like analytics data and those sorts of things. And so we do try to look at those things over time. Some websites, the client kind of takes over once we get to the launch point, it goes live, and then they kind of take it over and own it from there, and don't often get a chance to follow that journey long term.
Yeah.
But I can, but I always know, like looking from what they had to what the new thing, that we've made huge changes, right?
Yeah.
And so for the better. So yeah, so a little bit of both. Sometimes we have real specific data, and sometimes it's more kind of anecdotal.
The two things that I was going to call that you said so far that like are so crucial to the foundation is the contextual understanding, because so much of the ability to make something accessible is that it's usable, and that the contextual experience. And the other, the other piece you had touched on was that experience is key, right? We haven't talked a lot about compliance yet, which is kind of funny. So as we kind of get towards the tail end of the conversation, I'm just curious to get your take on where the biggest disruptions are that are coming into the accessibility space.
Yeah. I think a few of the things that, specifically kind of in the higher ed world that we've touched on a little bit, but like budgets and schools finding the funds to do it the right way, I think is a huge, when they can make the investment, that's a disruptor for good, right? And when they can't make the investment, that's a disruptor in the other direction.
Mm.
From that client compliance perspective you were just talking about, sometimes we get the, well, can't we just get an accessibility overlay or an accessibility widget? And, from all the research I've done and all the conferences I've attended and the experiences I've had, I'm always like, no, please don't. Like, for the most, now I haven't tested every single one, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend to say that they're all this way. But from my experience, most of them make things worse. And you might be able to point to a regulator and say, well, we did this accessibility overlay, and maybe that dismisses a lawsuit or delays things or buys you some more
Gets you
time.
sympathy. Yeah.
But in the long run, your users are actually having a harder time doing the thing that they wanted to do than before you did it. And so fighting that concept, and trying to push past the simple, easy button fix is a big thing for the future. I think I'll be really curious to see, and this is, I think a lot further down the road, but like when we get to WCAG 3, what does that look like? What does its final form look like? And then how long does it take for that to be the standard that everybody's held to, right? And hopefully it makes, testing more clear. It makes for improved user experiences. And hopefully because of those things, everybody gets on board pretty quickly, right? But I think that, that's a pretty long term, like I'm guessing a decade out probably still.
Yeah.
Which seems like a long, really long time. But I think that'll be interesting. Yeah, those are a few of the things that I see.
Cool. I always love hearing the unique perspective. So just as we get to the closing out of the conversation, I always like to just ask if there's anything that we didn't get to touch on that you want to close out with.
I think, what I would tell anybody who happens to be listening is, when you come to a closed door, keep knocking, right? Like I really truly believe that, everybody deserves and has a right to be able to access the information in the digital world. And that only happens when the people who care about that keep advocating for it, right? You may get a no this time, you may get a no next time, but keep pushing for the right thing. Keep pushing for the fix. When you're using something, even if even if you don't have a disability, even if you're not blind or you're not deaf, if you're using a website and you can tell that the color contrast is bad, or that, whatever that thing is that as a professional you see, even if it's not your product, it's just something that you've encountered in your daily life, man, find that customer service button, find that feedback button, click it, tell somebody about it, right?
Yeah.
And all those little things over time add up. And I hope that someday we get to a place in the world where, as coding technology gets better and AI technology gets better and all the things that hopefully someday it'll be impossible to build something that's not accessible. Like the technology just won't allow it. Right. And so, but that doesn't happen if everybody doesn't keep the ball moving.
You closed out in a beautiful way. Michael, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. Greatly appreciated it. Some amazing takeaways, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate you having me.